All right, everyone, we'll get started. Welcome to the MIT Wednesday Seminar Series. I'm Roger Peterson, the acting director, filling in for Taylor Fravel, who's on leave. And today we're very fortunate to have Professor Lynette Ong, who holds dual appointment in the Political Science Department at the University of Toronto and also at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and is a senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Her work lies at the intersection of authoritarian politics, contentious politics, and political economy of development. Today, she is going to talk on her book, Outsourcing Repression, Everyday State Power in Contemporary China, and it's won 4 major awards. Always good to start the semester with something which is we know is going to be good. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor.
Thank you so much, Roger. It's great to be here. So I will be talking about the way that I think the Chinese Communist Party state conducts everyday repression and how it contributes to its state power. So let me start with a quote from reading Lolita in Tehran. The worst crime committed by totalitarian mindsets is that they force their citizens, including their victims, to become complicit in their crimes, dancing with your jailer, participating in your own execution. That is an act of utmost brutality. So the theoretical puzzle that the book addresses is that we know that repression often invites backlash. So for an autocrat, for a dictator, how do you actually balance repression or coerced compliance on the one hand with minimizing backlash on the other hand? There's a trade-off, and how do you actually get the balance right? That is the puzzle that the book tries to address. In terms of empirical context, so I looked at China's very ambitious urbanization project, which started back in late 90s, early 2010. Unlike urbanization in most countries, when Li Keqiang first, the premier who just died a couple of months ago, when he first became premier, he actually announced that China is going to promote urbanization explicitly as an engine of growth. So we can look at it as China's style of urbanization is one of state-led urbanization, which is different from organic urbanization in many developing countries where you have jobs in urban areas, then people will move from the countryside to the cities. But in China, there's actually a hukou, an internal passport system being implemented, which stops rural residents from becoming full urban citizens. Now, that hasn't stopped them from going to urban areas to find better jobs and better employment opportunities, but they cannot become full citizens yet. So the empirical question is then, how is the Chinese state able to engineer massive urban transformation in such a short time frame with minimum resistance? The urbanization rates in China rose rapidly from about 40%, under 40% in the 90s, to 51% in 2011, and all the way up to 66% in 2022. So huge urbanization. And you would imagine in the process, a lot of people have been displaced as a result. But there's also a lot of people who have been moved, like urban residents. They have their homes torn down. They are moved to the outskirts of the cities. So there's actually a lot of dissonance. There's a lot of discontent. You imagine massive protests. And yes, there have been pockets of protests, housing related, land grab related type of issue, type of protest throughout China's kind of sprinkled throughout the countries, but they have never come together to become a land movement or housing movement that we see in India, in South Korea, and other developing countries. Why is that so? So that's the empirical context of the question. So the book proposes a solution in order to minimize backlash that comes with repression. The state can actually outsource repression to non-state actors, right? And with doing so, the state can then augment its state power. The type of non-state actors that the book examines are violent thugs and non-violent brokers. So the nature of violent thugs and non-violent brokers are as projected in the book cover. These are anonymous individuals. So these are individuals that you could find in the street that actually cannot be named because they are not any famous person. So these violent thugs are ordinary gangsters, hooligans, street hoodlums that are usually unemployed, and they get gathered together. They would come together and do a project for the government to help grab land and to do housing demolition. They are usually paid a daily rate of about 100 yuan a day, or they get paid a project rate. And the project would typically last for between 3 to 9 months. And after the project is done, then they get dismissed back into society. So these are not organized gangsters or mafias to start with, but they are kind of atomized individuals. Non-violent brokers that I look at are volunteers and community enthusiasts. So in Chinese community, there's a long tradition of serving the party. People believe in serving the party as a way of serving the community. And there's a long tradition of that dating back to, let's say, the imperial period, but more prominently so since the early Mao period, where Chairman Mao tried to encourage this sort of community spirit. And we see that during urbanization, where these volunteers and community activists are being mobilized by the state to convince people, to knock on people's door and trying to convince people to sign consent paper. They are also very clearly played out more recently in the implementation of zero COVID policies. So China had about 3 years of zero COVID, very strict type of COVID control. In the first 2.5 years, they had huge success with it. A lot of compliance, very, very minimal backlash in the first 2.5 years. That was largely because I would argue due to the credit and the work done by these community volunteers who are deeply embedded within the communities. They live in the community for decades and actually know the people well. So they could knock on people's door, trying to persuade them to do certain things without encountering minimum backlash. So the two types of agents are the thugs for hire and the brokers who exercise everyday repression and mobilizing the masses, the two mechanisms respectively. And with that, the state is able to augment its everyday state power. So you can imagine, if the state is able to penetrate society, the contours of state power must then be reconfigured. So the first diagram here, you could imagine that so this is the boundary between state and society. So if the state is able to mobilize these thugs for hire who sit in between state and society, the borders between them, they can mobilize them, which then go out there and repress society. So it's a cost minimizing strategy. So instead of the state going out there and minimize the entire society, it only needs to mobilize people sitting at the border between state and society who could do so. So this is how everyday repression works. The other mechanism is mobilizing the masses by mobilizing the brokers who sit in between state and societies. And these brokers, because they are deeply embedded within the community, they come with their own social capital and their own social network. This social network, which then allows the state to use it to its advantage. So when the state mobilized these people, these brokers here could then go out there and convince or repress the rest of society by utilizing their own social network. So the book really tries to encourage the reader or the audience to reimagine the contours of state power. That is, I think, a logical conclusion of outsourcing repression. So in a way, I think by doing so, it challenges some conventional wisdom. It challenges how we think about state repression, which is typically done by state agent, uniform agent who are paid for by the state. But in this case, if the state is able to outsource repression to non-state actors, it opens up, I think, a new Pandora's box of how we think about state repression. And with that, I think the contours of state power should also be reimagined, right? And by introducing thought work, what the Chinese call thought work, which I would call persuasion. So this is not propaganda, but actually individuals who go out there and try to persuade people on a one by one basis. I think it introduces a new tool in the autocrat's toolkit. So the book deploys three empirical strategy. The first one is ethnographic research, which I started in 2011, and I try to go to the field. I go to the field typically, twice a year. I was lucky enough to be able to do that right before the start of zero COVID in 2019. So my student also put together an original event data set. So this is not a protest data set, but one of state actions and citizens' response. It consists of about 2,000 cases of land taking and demolition cases. So when certain agent is present, what are the respective citizens' response when certain type of agent is sent to grab land or sent to demolish housing. We also do content analysis of a bunch of policy documents. So these are policy documents issued by the central government and various municipalities in Shanghai, Chengdu, and Zhengzhou municipalities, which I spend most time in. So the content analysis really articulates the intention of these governments, what these governments want, how they want demolition to be carried out, how they want land cases, land grabs to be carried out. So if you like, strategy number 3 tells you the intention of the government, articulates the intention of the government about how these actions should be carried out. But the reality may be different. So it complements strategies number 1 and number 2 that talks about what I actually see on the ground and what happened on an average case basis. So this is a map of where I went throughout the years. So I started back in 2011 in Hefei, which is a province quite close to Shanghai, but it's not really coastal. It's kind of middle income. And then I went to Beijing, Kunming, western part of China, which borders Southeast Asia. I spent a lot of time in Chengdu, in Sichuan province, including in the inner city, as well as outskirts of the cities, as well as the countryside. Then I went back to Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, Guangzhou, which are more coastal cities. I also spent quite a bit of time in Zhengzhou, which is the provincial capital of Henan province, which is I think a middle income, but towards a poorer province, which traditionally and historically has a lot of governance issue, and I did see a lot of corruption that comes with land grab issues. So the shades of the different map tells you, where I've spent most times. I've spent most time here in Sichuan, followed by Zhengzhou and Beijing. So outsourcing repression is really a two-step process. The first step involves the state marshalling a small group of society to become proxies. And the proxies, in turn, go out there to repress or mobilize the masses, right? It's a two-step process. The scope condition is that the proxies, i.e. the thugs for hire, as well as the brokers, must be complicit. They must be complicit to state's action. And with that gives rise to three dimensions of state power. One is participation of a small group of society. The small group of society would be the proxies. So once that is met, you could have acquiescence of the larger society, acquiescence of the society that they try to repress. And on selected basis, the state power could actually be legitimized, particularly in non-violent cases. So let me talk a little bit about the profile of these thugs for hire. So the nature is actually not that different from, let's say, the Wagner group, which Putin's tried to mobilize to fight the war in Ukraine. But there's also a crucial difference. And the crucial difference is they are actually not organized individuals, right? So thugs for hire, they are ruffians, they are hooligans, they are hoodlums, they are street gangsters, and sometimes legalized professionals, people who work with a security company, who render violence as a profit service. So people who are willing to sell their muscle power for profits. And this sort of violence that they exercise are actually low-level violence. It's actually either violence or oftentimes just a threat of violence, just issuing threat that I will carry out violence if you don't do certain things. And oftentimes the threat would actually work. So these are unemployed officials who go out. These are unemployed people or people who make trouble for a living. And they are not trained or armed violent agents, and they not typically bear arms. So you can imagine that their capacity for conducting violence is quite low. They are also distinct from the mafias, from the Japanese yakuza, and the Russian violent entrepreneurs, because they are not organized individuals. These are atomized individuals in society who are mobilized to conduct a project, who are dismissed when the project is actually done. So if you look at the nature of force that they execute and their capacity for violence, they sit at this bottom right-hand corner. The nature of force is definitely a private force, like that of mafias and militias and vigilantes. But their capacity for violence, to exercise violence, is actually much lower than most type of violent agents, because they do not bear arms. They are untrained individuals. So in a way, they are similar to mafias in terms of the nature of force, which is the private violence that they exercise, but they are not organized and they do not bear arms. And they are also very different from the military and the police, because they are individuals, private individuals. So what are the benefits of exercising everyday repression by thugs for hire? So these are perpetrators of illegal or illegitimate acts. They are hired to meet local government's unfunded mandates, and their non-state identity offers pretense of plausible deniability. So these are the people who do not wear uniform. They go out at 2 a.m. in the morning and try to beat up people or threaten landowners who don't want to give up their user rights, and house owners who refuse to vacate. They would threaten them in the middle of the night when they return from work, let's say. And oftentimes, the victim, they might know that these people are sent by the government or sent by real estate companies, but because they are not officials, there's no evidence, they could not actually trace and then bring them to be accountable, which is why there's a pretense of plausible accountability. And since the 90s, there has been a series of fiscal re-centralization in China. So lower level governments, they lacked funding to carry out a range of fiscal responsibilities, including providing public goods and services to local communities. So they oftentimes lack legitimacy. So when they go out there and trying to conduct some sort of policies, citizens would not comply. So they have to use a lot of violence and threat of violence to carry out the unfunded mandates. But there are, of course, costs involved in this sort of outsourcing violence. The cost usually comes when there's agency problems. When the agents, especially when they are not trained, they might use excess violence or excessive violence exceeding what is needed to get the job done, whether it's intentional or not. When an older woman was beaten up, when death ensues, when there's social media exposés about certain violence issues, then you get agency problems. Then you get accountability. That's when cost of I think outsourcing violence becomes more obvious. I've also been to villages where when you have a lot of these sort of outsourcing violence going on for, let's say, for more than a decade, and the local gangsters become more and more powerful, so powerful that they get termed the second government, because the formal village government has lost a lot of authorities. When they want to get things done, people refuse to comply. They have to go out to mobilize the gangsters to do things. It end up usurping state authority, right? So not so different in, let's say, a conflict zone, when the formal authority has to rely on violent groups to conduct a lot of state policies. Over time, these violent groups may actually end up usurping the formal state authorities. The second type of non-state actors that the book examines are non-violent brokers, right? Most of them would actually look like aunties in their late 60s and 70s, as portrayed here. So due to the high cost of mobilizing every member of society, a state actually needs brokers to connect with the masses. And conceptually, I divide the brokers into three types. The first types are political brokers. Because their power comes from state authorities, they are actually appointed by the party. So these are urban communities, people, neighborhood committees, rural village committees. So at the very grassroots level, China has 5 administrative levels. At the very bottom of the administration, in urban societies, are actually run by neighborhood communities and urban communities, right? The staff members. And in rural villages in China are actually run by rural village committees. They are paid for and appointed by higher level government. Social brokers, which is the focus of the book, their power comes from the social capital they command. So these are purely 100% non-state individuals. They have no party affiliation whatsoever. These are community volunteers, typically the elderly, and the enthusiasts. Very enthusiastic about serving the community, about doing things for the party. And they genuinely believe in that because they grew up in the Cultural Revolution era. And you also have the economic brokers, and I looked at a couple of cases in Shanghai. So the power of these brokers come from their capacity to reduce information asymmetry between the buyers of their service, who are people who want better compensation, and the supplier, who are the government or people in the demolition office. And they go out there and match market supply and demand. And the way to think about them is really these are purely profit-seeking intermediaries. They go out there just to make a profit. So housing demolition can be a very, very lucrative transaction in urban cities, in major metropolitan cities, such as Shanghai and Beijing and big cities in China, because you could imagine, even with this market slump in China, its property prices is among the highest in the world, right? As high as in New York City, Sydney, or London, or Boston, for that matter. So, to be able to get an extra apartment would actually make your family rich for another generation. So people are going out there to fight for every penny that they can. So they often try to game the government, and they know that the government is under a lot of pressure to get the project done. But to play that game, sometimes you cannot do it yourself. So this is where the economic brokers would come in. So in Shanghai, they are called the Huangniu. Literally means the cattle. So how they work is they work like ticket scalpers in our society, right? So these days, ticket scalping has gone online, right? Let's say if you want to go see a concert, right, Taylor Swift concert, you can't get the ticket. You might have to go online and pay 3 times more the night before, or you go out to the concert venue 2 hours in advance and trying to hang around and see whether you can find scalpers who could get you tickets at double the prices, right? And how are these ticket scalpers, able to secure tickets when you cannot get it from legitimate sources? Because they've got backdoor channel to the ticket office. This is exactly how these economic brokers work. So they team up. This is essentially a corrupt transaction. They team up with people in the housing demolition office. So housing demolition is part of the local government. They team up with them. They work with clients who want to secure more compensation, but to get compensation, you would need to meet requirements such as the number of people in the households. The more people you have, the more compensation you are entitled to, and the age of the people in the households, and the number of the square footage of your existing house. If your existing house is bigger, you could exchange for a bigger house. So these economic brokers help to produce a suite of fake certificate, fake birth certificates. They could fake a baby by having an extra person in the households would get you more compensation. They could also fake a marriage certificate, right? By saying that this person is married, you could have double the compensation. Sometimes, quite often, for communities undergoing housing demolition, it's quite common to find the divorce rate higher than other communities, because people will first get the divorce, then they try to get for more compensation, and after demolition, they get married again to the same person. It's a game that plays between citizens and local authorities, and these sort of things are extremely common in these communities. So 3 types of brokers. So the way to think about it is, I know that this concept of brokerage is actually a familiar one for people who study developing countries, right? So, but in China, typically, China scholars would think about a country being consist of state and society, and the state at the lowest level are street office in the urban areas and township in the rural areas. But in between them, there's actually a huge fat layer of brokerage, which if you squeeze them out, these are the brokers that I referred to earlier. And people often talk about how powerful the Chinese Communist Party state is. So I would actually argue that the power of the Chinese Communist Party state is that of is akin to a powerful octopus. The reason why the octopus is very powerful is because of its tentacles, who are the brokers. The brokers that allows the octopus to extend its grip into society, to penetrate society and grip society. It is actually the job of the brokers, political brokers, social brokers, as well as economic brokers. This shows you the number of times present in violent incidents of each agent types. So government officials, followed by the police and thugs, and different types of grassroots government officials. So you could see that the thugs are quite frequently deployed. Only third to government officials and the police. And this looks at the marginal effects of presence of different agent type. When different agent types are being deployed, what are the citizens' nonviolent responses? So the nonviolent responses are protest, petition, and legal mobilization. So the first bar refers to the thugs. So you can see here the marginal effects when thugs were deployed. Marginal effects of protest is marginally negative compared to government officials. The marginal effects of petition is also marginally negative compared to grassroots government. Here for legal mobilization is marginally positive, but way smaller compared to grassroots government. This is the marginal effects of agent types on violent citizen responses. So quite often, when these people are sent out to demolish houses, to grab land, the citizens become so emotional that they might pull out a knife or to stab the agent, or pour kerosene onto themselves and set themselves ablaze. They might be so emotional that they go out there and damage their own properties, right? Harming agent is marginally positive, but also smaller than when the police is being sent and quasi-security is being sent. Self-harm is marginally negative, also much smaller than other agent types. Damaged property, there's zero marginal effects compared to when the police is sent, which has very strong positive marginal effects. So I think the marginal effects, the event data set tells you the response of citizens on an everyday basis, on an average case basis. But they're exceptional cases because we do hear from the media, we do read from media reports that there's huge violence and there's protests that broke out. But so my case studies is actually selected based on what I would call failed cases, because I trace them back. I would look at media and social media where this village has experienced a huge, big violent cases because of land grab. And 6 months or a year later, I would go visit that village and try to understand kind of the mechanism, the causal mechanism behind. So if you like, the way that I select the cases means that they're actually failing in the first place. And with that, I try to understand what are the reasons that actually cause the failure of government repression, which then cause violence. So typically, as I mentioned earlier, there's an agency problem because of use of excessive violence, which then denies the benefits of plausible deniability by the government or the agents. And sometimes, it would also end up usurping state capacity. So the consequence is, as I've documented, in 2-3 of my case studies, local leaders get punished. This is because the reputation of higher government get put at risk. So higher government, that includes provincial government and sometimes even the central government, would step in. Let's say there's massive violence going on in certain cities because of housing demolition. A lot of thugs, a lot of violence were being used. They need to come in and punish somebody. And the person who were in charge of the urbanization project have their party membership stripped, removed from party, put on trial for corruption charges, which is just a facade for a range of guilt, for a range of actions that they have done. And in my case studies, I've illustrated that how that happens to a couple of mayors and party secretaries. So moving on to case studies. This is a case in Shanghai, in the former French concession area, which is 2 streets behind this building is a major shopping district in downtown Shanghai. So I came upon this neighborhood in 2016 when I was out there with a bunch of colleagues who were attending a conference in Shanghai. So this is in the middle of French concession area, one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the world. But there's an empty plot of land, and this area has been cordoned off. There's an empty plot of land which sits a half demolished house. I was very curious, so I asked around a few people and finally able to locate a foreign journalist who wrote a book about this. And he introduced me to a bunch of people to interview. And one of those people who used to live in this neighborhood, this guy is Mr. Chen. He told me that. So this is back in 2005. At that time, real estate companies could demolish houses could conduct demolition projects. They tried to burn down these properties because people wouldn't vacate. People did not agree with compensation. People refused to vacate, so they, in the middle of the night, they set out arson. They set this whole neighborhood on fire. Everyone managed to escape except an elderly couple who live in here. So the elderly couple were burnt to death. And the case was covered by media. By that time, there's social media, huge expose, which put the local government in a very bad light. So this project is stalled until today. So this is an example of a case that has actually gone wrong because of casualties involved, right? This is another case in Kunming in southwestern China. This is the provincial capital of Yunnan province. This is back in 2011. There's an old village which was demolished 2 years earlier, and people used their savings and the compensation from old village to build new housing in this new village. So in this what they call new village, 3 stories retail shops. So people would run retail businesses downstairs. They would open, let's say, grocery stores or small restaurants chain, and they would live on the 2nd floor and then rent out 3rd and 4th stories to migrant workers. So these are pretty wealthy, I would say almost middle class people who live in the outskirts of major cities in China. And they have got stable income from retail businesses as well as from rental. These are not poor, destitute people, right? So pretty middle class. So if you want to take away their properties without proper compensation, they will fight their lives with you because they have invested their savings and some of them still owe loans to the banks. And they've got stable income. And you take away everything without proper compensation, they'll fight the hell with you. So often, quite ironically, the most violent land grab cases are those that happens in the outskirts of major cities, like in Kunming, not in rural areas, because there's so much stake involved, and land prices is very, very pricey. And so from a local government perspective, there's a lot of money to be made. And for exactly the same reason, people are not willing to part with their land or with their houses. So you could see a bunch of elderly women sitting in front of this excavator because they use themselves as a shield. In Chinese society, there's this respect for the elderly. If you go out and harm these elderly people, it's a sign of disrespect, and you usually get the society pushed back. This is another case in Zhengzhou, which is the provincial capital of Henan province. It also happen in the outskirts of the major cities. So basically, Chinese cities are divided into ring road, right? First ring road, second ring road, third and fifth ring road. So outside of fourth and fifth ring roads, as the city expands, local governments want to grab land from these people. And these people 10, 20 years ago used to be farmers because these are all farmland. In the last 10, 20 years, they might have converted their farmland into these sort of retail shops. So they run businesses here and they would rent out, upstairs to migrant workers. These are not poor people at all. So in Zhengzhou, back in the mid 2010s, the party secretary, the deputy party secretary who was in charge of urbanization, tried to promote urbanization and convert a lot of these properties and turn them urbanized as a way of promoting local GDP growth. Tried to do it very, very quickly. And because of resistance, they had to use a lot of outsourcing violence type of strategies, mobilizing gangsters, and so on. So much so that there's a lot of resistance, but they did not care at all. They thought they could get away with it. And this diagram shows you there's a bit of a banner war going on in the village that I went to. So the government would put up a red banner saying that we try to expand your community space. That is a way of improving people's environment. And the next day, people will come in with a white banner and say that, don't you try to cheat us. We know that you are going against the law, right? There's a lot of these, tit and tat strategy and dynamics and resistance going on in Zhengzhou. But also, this is actually quite typical of major capital cities about 10 years ago. Major resistance. So in this case, the party secretary that I mentioned earlier, he also got into trouble. So at the end of it, 5 years after this, he was removed from office. He was charged. He was removed from office. His membership was stripped, and he was charged on corruption. So this is another example of failed case in my definition, because of excessive violence use. So now on to nonviolent brokers. So conceptually, the three types of nonviolent brokers are political brokers whose power comes from the state. So therefore, you have kind of solid arrow coming down from the state, and they use their brokerage, try to get citizens to comply with state policies. Well, you also have social brokers who are represented by dotted line, because they go out there and mobilize people using their own social capital. So it's not at all, it's not hard mobilization, it's not coercive, but it's mobilization through social influence, right? And you have economic brokerage who are represented by kind of double arrow, because it's really a bargaining process between state and society, being intermediated or brokered by these people who come in between state and society. So this is from the data set. So the data set collects a bunch of media reports and look at when different types of non-violent strategies were deployed. When the government trying to say, if you refuse to comply, your entire neighborhood would be punished for your non-compliance. And people hate these sort of strategies, right? Why should I be punished if my neighbor if my neighbor refused to comply? And collective punishment has a long tradition in Chinese history. Back in the imperial years, it was used to monitor community members. So let's say if someone commit a crime, the person might actually put the entire community into trouble. So everyone is forced to kind of keep an eye on each other. It becomes a very high, intensely surveilled society and internally surveilled. So this is collective punishment. And not surprisingly, it has very high resistance and low compliance. You also have welfare suspension. So some communities, some families receive low-income welfare from the government. So the government may withdraw welfare if you refuse to comply. And that also have very high resistance and almost no compliance, not surprised at all. Financial rewards. Government might give you bonuses, might give you carrots to induce you to comply. Compliance is quite high, 70% compared to 30% resistance. Sometimes because people just refuse to comply for whatever reason because they are forced to move out to outskirts of the city, which is so inconvenient that no amount of money will be able to make them sign the papers. But when thought work is actually deployed, you get even higher compliance compared to financial reward. So thought work is, literally speaking, what the Chinese would say. The way to think about it is, when thought work is conducted on the mass basis, it's like propaganda. You put out the big posters in order to convince the masses to comply with state policies. That's a state to everybody. But thought work is I would say, repression conducted on a one-on-one basis. So the state sends someone to convince one member of the society. So in a way, it has the same. It tries to achieve the same effect as propaganda, which is achieve higher compliance of state policies. But the difference is that you can imagine how costly thought work is, because it's not a state to many people. It's one state agent or one non-state agent to one member of society. And because you can imagine policies like urbanization and policies like zero COVID involves individual households. You cannot actually have policy compliance without understanding the family dynamics. So I looked at the case of, let's say, self-governed renovation committee in Chengdu. So it used to be the case that to conduct housing demolition, the state will have to send out the government officials to the family and make them sign papers. If they refuse to sign, then you have to send in thugs to intimidate people. But since about 2011, there was a lot of self-immolation cases, particularly in Chengdu. A woman, when she was forced to sign papers, went up to the balcony, set herself ablaze, pour kerosene and set herself ablaze with hundreds of onlookers and with social media expose. It really embarrassed the local government, right? There was so Chinese Communist Party, ironically, is a government that cares a big deal about its own legitimacy. It wants to be perceived as a benevolent government by its people. So it has to think about a clever way of kind of still conducting urbanization at a rapid rate, but able to do it in a way that is more palatable to the society. So the way they do it is they would encourage the setting up of a self-governed renovation committee. So the government would say, you want to do demolition, you set up a committee among yourselves. So the committee would be set up and spearheaded by the social brokers. So these are people, the elderly, who command social respect in the community because they are deeply embedded within the community. When they say something, they are more likely to get compliance. And these people, they are given early birds bonuses, say a couple of $1,000 or an extra apartment. And with early birds bonuses and carrots, they go out there and convince family. And they go out there and conduct thought work and encourage family members to sign papers. And there's a policy. So to get people to agree to demolition, you need to have 99% compliance rate. So one family might have five family members, right? If 3 agrees to sign to housing demolition, 2 disagrees, the entire family means no. So you have to go in there, these brokers have to go in there who understand the family dynamics and understand why are these two people refusing to sign, because they are actually not on good terms with their brothers and sisters. So they have to first go in there, mediate family disputes, and after mediating family disputes, they can get people to comply with state policies. And that sort of job can only be done by brokers who are deeply embedded within the community, not even by state officials, which makes it so costly, but also so successful, which is, I think, why thought work is even more successful than financial reward. So in a way, the state could then take a step back, and what used to be a state-society conflict, housing demolition, if there is pushback, it used to be a state-society conflict because the state officials would go in and try to get people to do it, right? But now it has become a society-society conflict. The state can take a step back, and any sort of disputes is actually one between the brokers or people who want to move and people who are not willing to move. So the state could then project itself as the savior who then try to come in and try to mediate disputes, but more importantly, could actually save a lot of cost of backlash, could save the cost of declining legitimacy compared to 10, 20 years ago when violence was more frequently deployed. So it's a very clever type of strategy. So I also looked at mediation, which works in a very similar way, that uses kind of persuasion and the grammar of human compassion to get people to comply. And I looked at the case of Huang Niu in Shanghai, which I alluded to earlier. It's like how ticket scalping works. So chapter 7. So this is coming to the end of the book. I looked at South Korea as a most similar case study, India as a most dissimilar case study. So before 87, before democratization in South Korea, the Seoul government trying to clear up a big slum in the city to make space for the Asian Games. They also deployed a bunch of gangsters to evict the slum dwellers. So I would say pre-87 South Korea is actually very similar to contemporary China. Post-87 South Korea, surprisingly or not surprisingly, this sort of outsourcing violence actually did not disappear with democratization. Government did the same thing, but instead of hiring gangsters, they had to hire people who work with private security company, right? So it becomes a legitimate way of doing things. But this private security company end up hiring gangsters anyway. So this is like, you have a bunch of gangsters who join the private security company, put on the uniform, but do the same jobs as they did before. So if that is the trajectory of South Korea, I would imagine that China may actually go down a very, very similar path. And if you look at how gangsters, how they have evolved over other East Asian countries, such as Taiwan, there's also a lot of history and transformation from below the ground to above ground type of private security type of situation. And because of other bunch of conditions, and I think it's very similar to China. India, interestingly, I think it presents itself as a very dissimilar case studies. I would never call myself an India expert, but as someone who has spent a lot of time in China, India is very, very interesting, and I suspect more similar to an average developing country because society is a lot more heterogeneous compared to China, and society could often push back against what the state does. So in slums in India, a lot of these slums, they are not recognized by local municipal government, so they don't have utility supply because the government refused to recognize them and they do not get electricity or water supply. So what you have is a bunch of gangsters, the gundas, who then rule these slums, right? So they would supply the slums with water, supply the slums with electricity, right? And these gundas, these gangsters, they are actually they have good bargaining power vis-a-vis local municipal government, because during election time they could deliver vote banks to the authorities. So they could go out there and then bargain with the state, which the brokers in China could never do, because they are so much weaker compared to the state. So the state society brokers dynamics is very different, which I think makes India a very dissimilar case. And the book also looks at Russia during Yeltsin's years, which is a lot weaker, and early Putin's year, which state capacity has recovered, and looked at the relationship between the state and criminal groups. Concluding chapter looks at how the arguments of outsourcing repression could be generalized beyond urbanization, could be generalized towards zero COVID policy, implementation of one child policy, which has been demolished for about a decade now. But when it was harshly implemented in the 90s and 2000s, in the case of non-compliance, a lot of violence was actually used against women to force them to sterilize and things like that. So when I first conducted this book project in the early 2010s, I would go around and try to sound my ideas of people. It actually caught a lot of people by surprise, because China is not a country that is known for its gangsterism. Even among the Chinese, I get quite a lot of pushback. People would say, this is Chinese Communist Party state, where's the gangsters? Because the state is so powerful. But I actually did see a lot of them, deeply hidden in pockets of rural communities that an average foreign journalist or an average foreign scholars wouldn't see unless you go, spend a lot of time in those places, hidden places. So when Xi Jinping first came to power, this is like 12 years ago, he launched an anti-corruption campaign, which almost everyone knows if you follow Chinese politics. But there's another campaign which he launched at the same time, which is the sweeping black campaign, the Sao Hei Chua. This is to root out black forces in Chinese societies. Who are the black forces? These are the gangsters, the gangsters, the hooligans. And in central government policy at the time, they single out 10 groups of people. And one of the groups that they single out were the gangsters who collude with local governments to conduct land grabbing and housing demolition cases. It was so prevalent, actually, that 10 years later, they actually grabbed the attention of Xi Jinping himself. So in a way, I feel that I was kind of vindicated. And the book also kind of, try to speculate about the implications for China's political future. I would actually, my view is that, I think Chinese style repression, which is the way that I talk about it, outsourcing repression, is actually hugely successful. But in more recent years, in the last 10 years or so, under Xi Jinping, the style of repression has actually changed. With the violent crackdown in Hong Kong in the last 5 years, with introduction of national security law and violent crackdown of the protesters, with the building of concentration camp and the re-education camp in Xinjiang. That has actually give people a different kind of idea of what Chinese style repression is. But if you take out those areas, if you take out Hong Kong, if you take out Xinjiang and Tibet, by and large, in mainland Chinese proper, I would say its style of repression is very much on an outsourced basis. And with that sort of repression, there's actually huge compliance with minimum backlash. That is how the government, I would argue, has been able to balance between repression and minimizing pushback from society. I also, speculate about or lament about, the state of field research in China. For someone like me who spent a lot of time in the field, quite sadly, this has come to an end with Xi Jinping's rule, and I'm quite happy to talk about that. And since the publication of the book, I have written a bunch of articles, and most recently in the Journal of Democracy, looking at zero COVID policies. I would say the way that zero COVID was implemented is actually very, very similar to urbanization. It was implemented for 3 years. High compliance in the first 2.5 years because of volunteers were deployed. These are people deeply embedded within the communities, very little pushback. It gets pushed back in the last 6 months, which after that culminated in the white paper protest. There's a bunch of protests in China to demand the government to abolish zero COVID policies in the late 2022. They also asked for Xi Jinping to step down. Very, very strong type of statement. That was because in the last 6 months, the virus evolved in such a way that it was impossible to contain. But then Xi Jinping still insisted on zero COVID. So they run out of people to deploy. They tried to deploy volunteers, they tried to deploy university students, run out of people. So they need to go out there to hire anybody who are unemployed, who lost a job from manufacturing sector, or some of them are even gangsters. Just mobilize them, pay them a lousy rate, and trying to beat up people you see on social media, trying to beat up people who refuse to comply. That is when you get resistance. So in urbanization in the last 2.5 decades, they use violent strategy, thugs for hire, in the first 15 years or so. And in the last 10 years, you see more non-violent strategies being deployed. But in zero COVID, the sequence is the other way around. You first saw non-violent strategies, huge compliance. Last 6 months, you get violent strategies, which introduce pushback. I think that actually illustrates my argument pretty clearly. And what you get is, as a result, is this mistrust, epidemic of mistrust. So at the end, zero COVID was abolished overnight with no justification at all, because people were protesting, local governments were running out of money because they have spent so much money on zero COVID tests and building these places, these camps to send people to. So it has now become I think a difficult society which is more difficult to govern, because a lot of trust between society and grassroots authorities are gone because of the tension that went on at the end of zero COVID. So I would leave it here. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your question.
Thanks. I think this research really challenges some of our conventional wisdom, not just on state-society relations in China, but in general. Yeah. You want to stand up?
I was trying to understand if those thugs for hire work for a lot of different clients, or if they just work for the state. And are some of their other clients state-owned businesses or factories, or do they also work for just private individuals? Because the everyday brokers I totally saw as being separate from the state, but I was just trying to figure out the connection between the state and the thugs. Thanks.
Should I answer that?
Answer that, yeah.
Okay, sure.
We'll take them one at a time.
Sure. So yes, but not as frequently as the government. And I think for a number of reasons. So you can imagine so this differs between localities, right? So in places where kind of governance is poor, when people could get away with violence, if the government, if a company or an individuals want to collect money from a family, let's say, they could hire these gangsters to go and collect, to make that sort of collection. This sort of situation definitely exists, but in places with kind of stronger rule of law, where the police actually does its job, it's more difficult to get away with it. So China is actually not like Hong Kong, where you see a lot of these things going on. So I would say that you have thugs for hire who get mobilized and work for the government more frequently than they work for private individuals.
Rich.
Am I supposed to stand up too?
Yeah, go ahead. Everyone stand up today.
I don't know. I don't know what we're doing, but I love standing up. Hi. I don't. Rich Nielsen. Nice to see you again. I'm really interested in what you called the emotional response that some Chinese citizens have to when the security apparatus comes and says, no, you really have to like move out of your home. Because I've heard about this phenomenon several times. And it's often framed as emotions. It seems to me to be strategic, that there's something about actually like the brittleness of the Chinese government that makes this action of like disturbing the peace quite threatening to that government. Whereas some of the Middle East regimes that I pay more attention to, they're like, cool, you're doing our job for us. If you hurt yourself or your property, we don't care. And I'm curious then how the thugs for hire makes that emotional response no longer effective. Because that's what it seemed like in your data, is that if the state comes, I harm myself as a way of rallying support. If the thugs come, I don't. And I'm curious to hear why. Like what that feels like, since you're an ethnographer and I'm very interested in like what the kind of individual perception is.
Sure. So to be sure, I can give you my speculated response, but in the book, I did not study emotions as a kind of a proper mechanism, right? So what I studied was citizens' violent and non-violent responses. I don't have the detailed data to study emotions, but if I have to kind of speculate and give you an educated answer, guesstimates, I would say when the fax is sent, people get angry, right? When a government official is sent, they get even angrier because they see the government as having no legitimacy to start with. But if a government officials that they actually know come in and trying to demolish their houses, take away my legal properties illegally, they get even angrier than if you send in a thugs. If both of them are just as violent. So this is not to say that thugs that being sent doesn't trigger anger. It does, but we know that the thugs are illegitimate. But when you try to send formal officials, a legal person trying to take away my legal properties illegally, I think they would be more angry than that. Yeah.
Interesting, thank you.
Yeah, but that sort of data is extremely difficult to collect, as you imagine.
Of course.
Yeah.
I think I have Daniel and then Mai, and then I got your hands up, yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Daniel Siegel, I'm a communications student. My question kind of builds on the previous one. So in your data, I'm a bit confused about how you're coding for violent thugs as being sent by the state versus whether there's, if you describe as being like unemployed, violent as like profit seeking. So how do you know, because it seems you're getting the data from like news sources, like failed cases. Are the news sources like that granular, right? It's like the thugs are sent by the state, right? Right? How do you not know it's just some other violent crime that's happening? And so you guys walk us through how you're making those coding decisions, where you're going to these news articles, because that would seem rather difficult to disaggregate whether that's working on behalf of the state versus some other client just from news articles.
Sure. So usually the sources are from the media, but also from human rights reports. So human rights reports sometimes have their own journalists, but quite oftentimes people who are eyewitnessing certain events or the victims themselves would actually phone into. So there used to be an era where you have Human Rights Watch and all sorts of China Human Rights Watch based in China or based in Hong Kong. This is no longer the case, right? Since Xi Jinping came to power. So people have detailed accounts of what they saw. So they would say an unidentified individuals. They would say a gangster. They would say someone with tattoo. They would not say someone with uniform. Someone wearing a uniform is definitely not a thugs. So we make that sort of judgment based on that sort of description. Of course, we do not know their background, but we do know the descriptors being put on different types of agents.
Thanks so much for coming, May Hessen. I really appreciate this presentation and your work. Just kind of thinking about the theory broadly, I really like this idea that, that when the state tries to do something that people don't want to do and tries to take action, there's often a backlash, right? That threatens the state's stability in new ways that the initial non-compliance with the act did in the first place. So then the regime then tries to outsource that repression, such as using thugs for hire, or in other cases uses non-state, non-violent strategies, but still outsourcing them, such as these brokers. But these are two very, very different outsourcing strategies that have different spillover effects, that have different costs, that have different emotional responses. And so I just want to hear a little bit more about the conditions under which the state might use one versus the other. And we started mentioning some of these, so saying the first period might be much more violent and then less violent, or the other way around, or in rural areas versus urban ones. But I also wanted to hear more about the recipients of these, who gets acted on, like their collective action potential maybe, or like the value of what it is that they're being asked to give up. We'd just like to hear a little more about the variation.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. So there's a slide that I didn't put up. So the scope conditions is these proxies, these brokers, you must have they must be witting or unwitting participation. So for the thugs for hire, they are witting participation. They know that they are participating in the state's bidding, and they are paid to do a certain job. But for the non-violent brokers, it's mostly unwitting participation. There's a normative belief in what the state does, that urbanization is genuinely good for the community. So they are going out there doing the state a favor, doing the community a favor. So it becomes a case of whether different types of brokers actually exist in the society. So in the communities, when you cannot actually find non-violent brokers, you have to use violent agents, right? And violent agents get things done a lot quicker than non-violent brokers, because they need to do it on a one-on-one basis, right? So in rural areas and in outskirts of the cities, when they are in a hurry, when local governments are in a hurry to get urbanization project done very quickly, oftentimes they borrow money from banks in order to lay out the infrastructure. They need to get it done very, very quickly. They have to use violence, because non-violent strategies take way too long, right? Violence is just a lot more expedient than non-violent strategy. So non-violent strategies is usually seen and used in central business districts of major cities like Shanghai, like Beijing, like Chengdu, where people are so astute and sophisticated that they just wouldn't comply. They would go out there and try to game the local government. And if you try to use violence against a Shanghai resident, you're really inviting trouble onto yourself, because these are highly educated people, right? They could use social media, take videos, and then upload to, or they might have a friend who could pull string with a New York Times or a Reuters reporter and could put local authorities into trouble. In that sort of cases, there's no alternatives but to deploy non-violent brokers to conduct state work, or what I would call persuasion. So it depends on the condition and the time frame. Over time, the government also tried to encourage more use of non-violent strategies because of the cost involved with violence.
Kelly Greenhill, if you can emerge from behind the pole.
We've already said my name, so do I really have to stand up? Thank you, Lynette. That was really great. One quick question that follows on Maya's was sort of on a percentage basis, how often do we see violence versus nonviolence? And then on the use of thought work, I wonder if, this is just a thought experiment, I wonder if even though the costs up front might be high, that thought work might be more effective and less costly than it appears to be. And that if one has a one-on-one set of engagements with influencers or with people who have enough social capital that they can persuade others, might it be hiding higher levels of compliance because if one can convince the right people, they can convince others to comply? Does your study allow examination of that, or maybe you've already thought of it and dismissed it? So, any thoughts on that?
Sure. So on a percentage basis, I would say there is a temporal variation and regional variation. So let's say from the late 90s to the early 2010s is more violent than non-violent. Non-violent strategies really caught on fire after 2011. So after the self-immolation case that I talked about earlier in Chengdu, where this woman poured herself kerosene and set ablaze. After that, there was a change in law that barred or make it illegal for real estate companies to conduct housing demolition. So only local authorities could do so. So even though it is still violent, but it becomes a lot less violent, right? So there's a temporal variation from violent to less violent, especially after early 2010s. The regional variation is inner core of the city, central business district, very non-violent, especially in the later half. These days, you could hardly find any violent cases around. So I was in the field about 5 years ago. I searched the internet very hard for violent cases in major cities. In Chengdu, I couldn't find any, right? Whereas 10 years ago, it was very common. So regional and temporal variation, and with I think thought work, it is costly in terms of the energy of these brokers, and these brokers are becoming very scarce because you can imagine that people who genuinely buy into CCP's belief, who buy into Xi Jinping's thoughts, who buy into serving the communities, it is becoming smaller and smaller as a proportion of the population. So these elderly, in 20 years' time, they'll be gone. And how does the state mobilize people anymore? I think this is becoming a challenge for the state. But with Xi Jinping, he's trying to revitalize the sort of community spirit that was very popular during Mao's time. You could see that very clearly coming through in Xi Jinping's policies. But it's costly in terms of the non-brokers' time, but very successful if done properly for the state.
But no evidence of snowball effects. Once you've seen some successes, more follow in terms of.
What do you mean by snow?
Well, like so, if a broker goes into a community and convinces a community leader, a local elite, or someone with a lot of social capital, those people might wittingly or unwittingly become a kind of broker themselves because I have been persuaded, and therefore my peeps become persuaded. So that's what I'm saying. Maybe the costs are actually lower in the aggregate, maybe not.
I see. That is interesting. I would say that people people might go out there and trying to convince more people if they receive carrots. So so once you convince a family, and then you give them carrots once if they could go out and convince more, like you give them $1,000 for every family that they could convince. I think they can try to convince people that way. Yeah.
We're running out of time, so I'm going to take 3 questions at a time, and you can take whatever you like. So, Jim Walsh, Chicago, and Barry.
I'm Jim Walsh, and there's very little difference between when I stand up and I'm sitting down. Obviously, very important work. I'm sad that you cannot return to continue to work, but we're paid to be skeptics. So, if I was being skeptical, I'd say, how much plausible deniability are they buying? It seems like it's implausible, plausible denial. I mean, it's a small village. Lots of families are being gone after. This happens over many years. They can't put 2 and 2 together and blame the government. Maybe they're 5 points less mad, but come on, they should be able to figure it out. I mean, that would be one. And then the other thing I would say is, it seems like the central question is, how they manage avoiding the backlash. and that they're successful at that by farming out the violent part. But isn't the second campaign, the black dog or whatever campaign, isn't that evidence of the backlash? Right, it takes a while for stuff to build, and then if they go after it, doesn't mean there was a backlash.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So both together. Hi, this is Chicago. Very happy, and it was very interesting. Thank you so much. So I'm trying to get the whole picture correct. So the two agents that work, one is basically a very loyal members that support the party, right, and very close to the state. And the other one is, I wouldn't say outcast, but they're marginal people that don't have regular jobs and they're just hired for the day or for the duration of things. So not really sort of outskirts. So they're very different types of groups. So maybe the marginal ones are very, not too loyal, doesn't think about the state or the party. So when the local government actually implement this, do they do it in like a procedural strategy? I'm assuming that the first one would be the financial compensation. And are they the ones that decide which ones to employ where, or do they try to do the antes first, or try to look for them, and when that's not successful, move on? And are they the ones that decide and pick? So that's one thing. And it seems that your failed cases were all the cases of extreme violence in urban setting, right? But you said it was more the aunties that employed in the urban cases. So was it just a mismatch that led to the failure? And thirdly, if you can, the urbanization is good. Do they get through like a collective, thought activities first to be, propagandized first, and then the aunties go out trying to figure out how penetrating the state ideas? Good. Sorry, you can just pick.
It's all right, we had 2 people and 5 questions, so anyway.
I'm Barry Cozen. I just want to ask you to say just a little bit more about what you've already said, which is, are both of these tools basically wasting assets, each for their own reason? So, atomized thugs. Judging from the Xi campaign against these black organizations, it sounds like some thugs remained atomized and some didn't. And once they got rooted, the state began to realize they created a monster and they had to go after them in a heavy-handed way. And then the other one you spoke about, the sort of the brokers have, as you suggested a second ago, they're beginning to disappear because either of demographics or because of modernity, changing neighborhoods, et cetera, right? So the question mark there is, what's the replacement? So you have a question about the violent thugs, which is, have they become more trouble than they're worth? Is it too late to get rid of them? Are they too organized? And then the other one is, can you continue this broker thing, or is it basically done and they have to find something else? And maybe that explains the rise of the surveillance state, because they're compensating for the fact that they're losing the broker state.
Excellent questions, right? Yeah, so excellent that I feel that I want to go out there and write another paper, right? But so I'll address them in. So I'll address them in reverse order. I think you are right that I think both type of brokers, violent and non-violent, are actually disappearing. If not disappearing, they are actually declining in numbers, or their availability to the state is actually declining under Xi Jinping's rule. Because in a way, Xi Jinping is trying to centralize control. The way that you centralize control is you get rid of all the intermediaries, right? And with the non-state brokers, younger people do not believe in the state anymore, not as much. So once these people are gone, there's fewer people that they can mobilize. And in terms of the violent agents, they are now being swept under the carpet. So they are gangsters in China, but on relative scale, they are really not as powerful as in other countries. they are gangsters, and some of them do collude with the police and with local authorities. But their activities has been more heavily constrained by the party compared to before under Xi Jinping. In the cases that I have observed, the government does not work with organized gangsters. They work with atomized individuals. And now I'm not saying that I have seen the entire China, but I think there are some logic to that. Because if you go out there and work with organized gangsters to start with, you are creating enemies for yourself. You want to work with people that you can actually control. It's a principal-agent relationship. Why would you want to hire an agent who is very powerful to start with, like the Wagner Group? The risk of that usurping your authorities is much higher when you work with a weaker agent. I think there's a logic in working, if you're a principal, working with a much weaker agent. And those are the cases that I have actually seen, right? For your question, this is like the scope conditions, really. I think it depends on the availability of brokers, of violent versus non-violent brokers. It also depends on the time that we are speaking of and the conditions of the locality. So it's a supply and demand issue, supply of brokers as well as different time frame and receptiveness of the community. So plausible deniability, I think, works at two levels. One is whether or not when you get beaten up or you get threatened by a gangster, by a thug, do you actually know who sent them? I think most people know. I would say 99%, they know that it's connected to a paper that I refused to sign last month. But there's no evidence. You can't trace accountability and then ring up the police and then bring them to court. As opposed to a government official, you can actually do that, right? So it's first level of plausible deniability, which most people would say is denied, because you cannot deny that. People know that cognitively, they know they are sent by authorities, but because they are unidentified individuals, you cannot trace accountability to them. This is the second layer of deniability, which I'm referring to. Yeah. I think I've addressed most questions.
Well, we have several hands up. I'm afraid we're already past the hour. So,
But I'm happy to talk later, or just shoot me an email.
all right. So
Yeah.
let's thank our speaker.
Thank you so much.